Welcome back to Power Lunch. You're on NDTV Profit. I'm very pleased to welcome in our continuing series of conversations with BMR Associates. Today, Gokul Chaudhri, leader direct tax with BMR Associates. Gokul, welcome to NDTV Profit. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to get right to it, and I'm starting with the energy sector, which is one that you follow very closely. On the policy side, what do you realistically expect Arun Jaitley to deliver come Monday?
Well, I think Monday, as we speak, the budget's probably gone in for print.
Yes.
And therefore, there's a little bit of hope that he should have paid some attention to the energy sector and the projects in the energy sector. Now, let's just look at what the energy sector has done to this finance minister's budget. It has brought in 90,000 crores because of the dip in the crude prices. And that's been a big savior for the finance minister. But one of the things that needs to be recognized is that India has a number of upstream projects which have been in the works for quite a bit of time. And when the oil prices had been inching all the way to $147 a barrel, the government had been increasing the cess on these projects to collect more revenues. Today the prices are down and these projects need attention. They need attention because if the cess is not recalibrated, what you will see is that we will be having an impact on domestic production and therefore our domestic projects. So one of the important things is that while the country as a consumer of energy benefits from the lower energy prices, it should continue to have a recalibration of the oil cess to make sure that the domestic projects which are there in the country producing oil and gas, specifically from the pre-NELP era, have a far more competitive play.
Okay, so let me just take that sort of point and extend it fully and clearly. When we're talking about initiatives or incentives by the government to really promote domestic production, what all could that include and encompass? I would
zero on 2 or 3 things. One, from a policy perspective, the government needs to recognize that we are no longer in a high energy regime, high energy price regime, and hence some of the recalibration has to be done from a policy perspective. Investment is not going to come in as easy as it was before. The second aspect is the tax regimes that have been placed on the upstream sector needs to be reworked because again, you cannot burden that. You can certainly continue to collect money through excise duty at the front gate of the fuel stations by having higher cess and surcharges there, but not at the producer level anymore. So therefore, if you look at the fact that the government brought in an NCCD on crude oil before, it brought in an oil cess before, all of those need to be reworked out to make those projects viable.
Okay. Do you think that the likelihood that the government is thinking on these lines, because I think you made a very compelling point up front. You said, look what oil has done for the finance minister's budget, sort of added and given him 90,000 crore rupees worth of leeway.
Correct.
So perhaps that in itself is going to put the spotlight on the oil sector. But realistically speaking, I mean, is that the approach the government is likely to take?
The government has been progressive to the extent that it did have meetings with the industry. And the industry representatives did bring out these aspects. And I was happy that the government was listening to them. It engaged with them and it understood these issues. And it also understood that in the long term, it is important that India, just like it has Make in India, it needs to produce in India. And it needs to give incentive to upstream projects in India, specifically at this point of time. So I think there has been a listening. How much of it translates now into the budget process is what we'll need to see on Monday.
Let's take a slightly different route now and talk about the renewable energy space, because again that is sort of one area that seems to occupy a fair bit of government mind space. Where's the next wave of incentives and support likely to come from in the budget?
If we look at the renewables industry, and I think that's really been powering really the energy generation or electricity generation which has happened. I think access to capital and competitive capital, that means the cost of equity needs to go down, the cost of debt needs to go down. Those are two critical issues for the renewable sector, which means effectively that the finance minister who had brought in a 5% withholding tax on ECBs for a period up to 2017, that needs to be given a roll forward, because some of these energy renewable projects are something like a 10-15-year projects, and there's a long pipeline of these. And therefore, the extension of the ECB 5% withholding to make sure that they can access international debt at a more competitive price needs to continue. The second part is on equity, and I think that's where the government needs to rethink on how it wants to tax equity, and not just for renewable projects, but across the spectrum. And whether that means that lowering the dividend distribution tax, or by reworking the dividend distribution tax back to the dividend withholding tax, such that we have a situation where the cost of profits back to the investors is brought into a more competitive zone.
Particularly that, given that there is a whole, vast need of capital in this space as this renewable energy push, carries on as far as the government is concerned. A slightly different lens, and I'm going to just take a step back and say, when we're talking about energy and oil and gas in particular, on the policy side, and I know that, that's an ongoing process. You don't need the budget really to address the policy issues. But take a moment, Gokul, and just list all of the policy reforms in the oil and gas space that are on the government's to-do list.
Well, the government did start with a very active engagement on the policy side, and we must remember that the oil prices were still very high when the government stepped in. The first and foremost was the government said, look, we seem to be getting into a lot of arbitration and disputes with the producers in relation to the production sharing contracts, and therefore they said, should we not go to another regime which is called the revenue sharing regime? Dr. Kelkar and other very wise men said, well, I don't think that makes a lot of sense. There were others who were in votaries of the revenue sharing model. And I think what has happened today is that we have a production sharing regime which is in place and has been there. The government talked about a revenue sharing mechanism that's been talked about, but we haven't had an outcome of which way the government wants to go. So that's one thing which is ambiguous as to which direction the government wants to go insofar as dealing with the upstream projects are concerned, because we must recognize that the oil and gas assets belong to the nation, they belong to the sovereign, they belong to the Union of India. And therefore, the whole thing is about how the natural resource allocation rules need to really work. And that's where production sharing versus revenue sharing are two different mechanisms, and the government needs to take a call on that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be addressed in the budget. It can be done beyond and outside. Absolutely. It should be done beyond and outside, because there's just so many things in the budget that will otherwise clutter that space. The second aspect which is there is that, the government keeps coming out with rounds of exploration where it actually, carries a set of acreages for investment to international community as well as domestic players. The thinking has been this should be all year round. Right. Why have this in a manner where, government needs to float rounds and tenders and all that stuff, allow the investors to choose the acreage that they wish to go for, let there be a framework so this becomes all year round sort of stuff. The third issue which is there is how independent should be the regulator for the upstream sector or for the energy sector as a whole. And, we've had this debate for a while. Should we be controlled by the Ministry of Petroleum, or should we have an independent Director General of Hydrocarbons coming in? How independent should be the Petroleum Regulatory Board that has been established? So I think the regulatory framework and the role of regulator needs to get better defined. And the expectation would be that let's try and use this period of low energy prices when there's not so much of a crisis on the government to really address some of these things, because there seems to be more breathing room. Absolutely. In a sense, even mentally speaking, for those at the helm of affairs. We're going to put the pause button on the energy space, on the oil and gas space, and shift to, manufacturing, capital goods in particular. Talk about also some of the startups and the tax environment and incentives around that. Gokul, let's start with, direct taxes insofar as they affect manufacturers, insofar as they affect the capital goods space. Put the top couple of priorities that the government must address in this budget out there. Well, I think the government's already done some of the stuff in the last two budgets from a direct tax perspective. Firstly, they brought in an investment allowance. As I said, we will give you a 15% deduction in relation to capex that you spend on large projects and so forth. There's some problems in the fine print, which always sort of the draftsman does, and I hope the finance minister cleans that up in the course of this budget. But as far as the incentive is concerned, they brought in additional depreciation, they brought in an investment allowance, they brought in some backward regions for Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. So really some of the stuff has been done from a direct tax perspective.
So, but what are the prickly points still? Just give us an example.
So if, for example, the rule said you invest 25 to 50 crores or more and you acquire plant and machinery and you install the plant and machinery, we'll give you this deduction. But they said acquire and install in the same year. Now, a lot of these large gestation projects don't move that quickly. And the question, therefore, is, are you opening me up for a litigation season here? And, people are very wary of incentives which come with the litigation overhang on them.
Okay, so that's one set.
The second aspect which is there is the whole space of SEZs. SEZs were meant to be the manufacturing zones of this country for export purposes. And, there's been a bit of flip-flop on the SEZs and the tax incentives around SEZs. And now, of course, the finance minister has put the roadmap of taking away the exemptions altogether from 2017. And the question, therefore, is that what happens to SEZs as a concept and as a place for manufacturing in a large, significant manner? So I think fixing that is a key issue. One of the recommendations would be, do we want to really link 2017 when SEZs need to kick in all the activities? Or can we have a graduated basis to say that somebody who starts in 2018 or 2019, which is post the threshold that the finance minister has indicated, will get benefits, but for only the remaining period?
Okay.
So, if somebody was to start in 2017, he gets a 10-year tax break. If somebody starts in 2019, allow him an 8-year break. That's one part. Second is the whole thing of R&D weighted deductions, because manufacturing also needs some amount of activities in relation to R&D to be able to be competitively moving along. And different countries around the world are having a lot of incentive programs for trying to house R&D and innovation in their countries. Similarly, India needs to continue keeping some of the weighted deductions for R&D in its portfolio. And I think finally, when you're sort of extending manufacturing into a little bit of the infrastructure space, the whole question that comes up is, how are you going to make the InvITs or the REITs for infrastructure really more workable? Because they brought in the rules, but they haven't been very comfortable.
Again, that's such a critical one, isn't it? Give me some examples of how they can be made more workable.
Well, you look at InvITs. InvITs, you have an interest payout to the investors. The tax cost is 30%. Unless you're a non-resident, with the tax cost is 5%. So let's address 30% tax cost on the interest payouts is a pretty significant cost for InvITs to run with. So we need to look at some of the finer points of the InvITs in the REIT structure and make this work. And maybe the starting point, insofar as the InvITs and the InvITs is concerned, is why not get the folks like the NTPC or the ONGC to take some of the more mature assets and place them in InvIT structures such that you are able to offload them onto the sovereign funds and the pension funds and so forth, and release capital by the PSUs and other investor bodies to be able to put into fresh investments. So really roll your assets a little better using InvITs.
That sounds fairly radical, doesn't it, Gokul?
Well, we need, the fact is this government came in pretty hungry for change. And the question is, does it remain as hungry for change today? And if it does, then I think we need to be innovative about how we deal with the divestment issue. Because very clearly the government had put an ambitious divestment agenda, 57,000 crores. It hasn't taken place. The question is, do we look at InvITs, do we look at REIT type of structures to actually unlock a lot of the capital that the PSUs have put into brownfield projects?
Okay, one final thought from you on, and this is again an unfair sort of question I'm posing to you, but when you look at the indirect tax regime through the lens of manufacturers, through the lens of capital goods, what are the changes that you would recommend?
Well, the first thing is, for the very first time, the government has come up with, which is a brand new document called the National Capital Goods Policy. We never had we had a manufacturing policy. We didn't have a policy designed towards the capital goods industry. So they brought that out, which is good, because they are actually then saying, okay, we have to address this key area. And I think they've started talking about it. They put a document in place, etc. The question is, how strong are they going to be on the implementation of that policy? Because they're talking, they're going to bring out schemes, they're going to bring out budgetary allocation towards this initiative. So really, the capital goods industry is at the core of manufacturing. Similarly, they are also talking about how they're going to make the Make in India program work for the defense industry.
Right.
That's a very big industry which we don't have a very large manufacturing base in, but that's something which the government has a great influence upon. So capital goods, defense industry, and then of course the wider sphere of what they want to be doing with manufacturing in general under the Make in India program.
The clock is ticking, but I have to push in one final question on startups, and we spend a lot of time discussing and the whether this India is an easy place for startups to arise in, to continue to do business in. In this budget, are you expecting anything directly and specifically aimed at startups?
Mr. Modi went all the way to Silicon Valley. He went to Facebook. He went to Google. I think he's come back duly impressed that India needs to have a startup culture. And I think he recognizes that the startup culture is not just about tax incentives to be given to startups, which is something that they've talked about in the fine print. But it's also about the fact that startups need an ecosystem where investors feel comfortable and failure is not punished.
So two things in the budget that will make investors more comfortable and make failure more palatable.
Well, as for failure more palatable is the fact that they are saying the bankruptcy code has to work far more efficiently, and therefore they brought in the bankruptcy bill into the parliament for debate. And I think if we get that out, it's a great thing to happen, because let's not forget that startups, some of them are, of course, the unicorns, but a lot of them really don't go through the full life cycle. And therefore, you need to have an ecosystem that enables people to put that behind and move on to something else, and not punish them for the rest of their lives for having started something.
Right.
That's one part of it, which is more from a company law perspective as well as a wind down perspective, which is good. Insofar as the investors are concerned, he has brought in some of the tax leniency in the rules to enable them to be able to fund some of these startups without having some of the anti-abuse provisions that currently exist and can be a handicap to startups. So he's done some of the stuff. Now what we have to watch is how do these announcements that took place in Vigyan Bhavan a month and a half ago really get translated into the union budget now, and is the fine print going to be as enabling as the talk has been?
And that's the critical one, isn't it? I mean, the talk and the fine print, sometimes there's a bit of a misalignment.
Absolutely. And, if you look at it historically, the finance minister had the noble intent of saying, I want to get the fund managers back from Singapore and Hong Kong to be based in India, and he brought in a set of rules for it. I think in the fine print of rules, there are some 31 odd conditions, which made it unworkable. Similarly, they brought in the place of effective management rules. And again, those are some which have caused a lot of agony to investors and said, really, is this what India really wanted to do? And our answer is, from a policy perspective, I don't think that's what they wanted to do, but the fine print went all over the place.
Unfortunately, they tied themselves up in knots with the fine print. Gokul, we're going to have to wind up our conversation for today. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon on NDTV Profit, and of course, for patiently walking us through the expectations from Budget 2016 this time around when it comes to the energy sector, when it comes to manufacturing, capital goods and startups as well. We're going to take a quick break. Back in a moment.